Hey there YouTube! For the purposes of this video I will be using the term God quite a lot, but when I use that term I'm not referring to any specific monotheistic preconception of the term. Rather, it's going to be a blanket term that refers to God, the notion of God and of gods, indeed, of deities, divinities, and to a lesser extent metaphysics and spirituality in general. There are many atheists in the world, and particularly in operation on YouTube, who believe that only with the death of God will humanity be able to move forward, will humanity pull itself out of a particular mire of ignorance, or a perceived mire of ignorance, and so on and so forth. And there seems to be a preconception that the death of God will bring about some sort of cultural revolution, as it were. The death of the notion, the decay of it, the abandonment of it. I'm not necessarily sure this is so. I don't think the extinction or the gradual abandonment or decay of the notion of God would result in anything positive at all, really. I don't think it's going to happen, personally. I think that it's something of a pipe dream. Once ideas are mooted, they tend to stick around, particularly ones that are so culturally entrenched and mandated as the notion of God or gods. Whether we like it or not, the fact that so many different cultures, in fact all human beings, almost all human cultures in history have thrown up some mythology or some notion of divinity. And this suggests that there is something intrinsic about that notion, that whether it has some external existence or not, it does something, it expresses something about humanity. And the fact that they subsist throughout ages and generations, they don't die, these concepts. Rather, they evolve, they change. They tend to go from... There is a tendency for them to go from the status of absolute belief into abstraction, which is something that certainly happened with the ancient mythologies, such as the pagan Celtic mythologies, the Nordic mythologies, the ancient Greek, and so on and so forth, until they become structures of storytelling, which is in my opinion, is their highest possible state. It's something that we're currently having issue with the monotheistic religions. They haven't quite made that transition yet, simply because they're not quite as evolved as the more ancient pagan mythologies, the polytheistic ones. That's not to say that they do not contain certain elements that are superior. They do. The monotheistic religions and mythologies tend to contain this notion of the abstract God, the God that exists beyond reality, which is something that drives a particular train of thought, or rather it used to drive a particular train of thought. That has resulted in many cultural revolutions, intellectual epiphanies, the evolution of the concept of metaphysics, and it once served as a great metaphor and vehicle for cogitation. Ironically, it's become something else instead now. In the postmodern age, it's become something else. It's become a weight and a shackle rather than a vehicle for transcendence, which is what it was originally designed as, ironically. If you actually bother to go and read what the original, what some of the earlier Christian writers and Judaic writers actually wrote, and if you study what they actually believed and the way the cultures actually worked, you find that there were sects of them that didn't actually believe that the stories they promoted were literally true. Rather, they operated in very much how the ancient Greeks seemed to generally regard their gods and goddesses, that is, as stories, as mythologies, as vehicles for storytelling that reinforced particular lessons, but also served in a Socratic way. They were stories that inspired thought and cogitation, and thereby personal transcendence and transgression, and that is what they are for. That's what mythology should do, in my opinion anyway. This is entirely subjective, obviously. This is what stories and art and whatnot are for. This is the importance of mythology to me. I think mythology is very important to humanity and storytelling, and I don't think it should be abandoned. I don't think it should be put aside, regardless of how abhorrent we might find some of the behavioural tenets that occur in them. We're human beings, we're critical beings, we have the capacity to pick and choose. And it's funny that a lot of the more extreme adherents of these mythologies condemn others for doing that. When they do it as well, everybody does. It's the nature of humanity, and B, it's not a bad thing at all. By picking and choosing what's good and determining what's bad, you are using your critical faculties. You are taking from the material what's positive, what's productive, or what you consider positive and productive, and ignoring the rest, which is what you should do. Yes, for my money, God cannot die. It's been mooted. Not only has it been mooted, but it has become culturally entrenched, and also entrenched in the collective psyche. It is there. The idea and the notion of God is there now. And I imagine that even if we were able to create a totalitarian state in which all notions of God were repressed, there is an entire generation that were not programmed with a particular concept of God, then I imagine if they were left alone, a concept would arise anyway. Simply because of the way our minds work. And it is not necessarily a bad thing. Rather, I believe that the notions, the preconceptions of God under which we currently operate, under which religions currently operate, must by necessity evolve. They must change. Our preconceptions of what God consists of must change. And the sad thing is, this is something that can't happen forcibly. It's not something that can happen at the end of a gun or a knife or with ridicule. It's something that must happen very slowly in increments, and I think the best way of doing it is through A, discussions like this one, and B, through fiction, through storytelling, and through philosophizing. There are lots of authors and writers and artists and poets who explore this very notion, and not just modern ones either. There are plenty of theistic or deistic writers, artists, philosophers, etc. throughout the ages who explore this concept. William Blake, a lot of the Romantics are classic examples. The Romantic poets tended to have a very enlightened notion of what God and metaphysics consisted of in context with their time, which is why many of them were arrested or excommunicated or ran away, went into seclusion, because they would have been arrested otherwise. William Blake in particular has a notion, the imagery he uses in his poems and the language he uses is biblical, it's Christian. However, he would not be described as a Christian by most others who describe themselves as such, because his notion of God is as a thing of transcendence. It is a thing that allows personal transgression and which celebrates almost any and all experience as transformative. It's also very surreal and very bizarre in context with the standard church-mandated concepts of God. William Blake believed that he spoke to angels and demons on a regular basis, and from those experiences developed his personal notion of God, which is this. It seems to be this protean, surreal, and completely incomprehensible thing to which he does not attach particular characteristics, because he seems to acknowledge that attaching characteristics to it also attaches limitations. And this is something that advocates of in particular the monotheistic gods, do not understand, that their attachment of particular values and characteristics to this entity, who they proclaim as divine and as perfect, actually places it under limitation. I particularly find this with regards to the moral concepts that they attach to it. For my money, considering the notion, if there is an entity that is analogous to, say, the monotheistic notion of God, that is a one entity that is the creator of all, and that is perfect, then morality would be negligible. It would be a redundant concept to it. Why? Well, what does perfection necessarily entail? For me, it must necessarily entail very particular characteristics. Omniscience, the immediate and natural comprehension of everything. Everything. Every permutation of every way reality might conform, down to the most minute detail. So, this entity must know every thought you have or could possibly have, every feeling you have or could possibly have before you know it. It already knows you more intimately than you know yourself, and it knows everything, everyone and every entity more intimately than it knows itself. And it also knows every permutation of that entity. And being omnipresent as well, which is another characteristic applied to, that must necessarily be applied to this entity, it must also exist in those possibilities where you have fulfilled those emotions and thoughts. So every permutation of you that might exist throughout reality, regardless of what consequences that permutation might have with regards to its actions, it already knows, it's already there. Therefore the notion of morality is utterly redundant to it. The morality, it doesn't need to limit behaviour, and it doesn't need to judge behaviour either, because it already knows everything about it already perceives every possible consequence of behaviour, and consequence is redundant to it anyway, because every possibility must necessarily play out. If this entity is omnipresent, it must. And this, I think, demonstrates just how limited the preconceptions of God under which the traditionally entrenched and currently pervasive religious structures that purport to be the ultimate authorities on the subject are. It seems to me that the gods they promote are very human, very finite, very limited. They demonstrate very human characteristics and limitations that occur as a result of our biology and our intellectual limitations. For example, if you take the gods of the Bible and the Quran, they demonstrate surprise when things don't go their way. Take the Noahic flood as an example. The experiment that is God's earth and his creations don't work out the way he wants, so he floods the world for some bizarre reason. And being an omnipotent entity, he could just simply click his fingers. And this is the funny thing. The very story demonstrates the limitation of this God. Of this purportedly perfect being, because he wouldn't be surprised. He would already know that this is the way this reality was going to conform. He would already exist in the state where the reality had conformed this way anyway. He must necessarily, otherwise he's not omnipresent. But he would also exist in those realities where it had conformed elsewhere. Not only that, but let's for the moment assume that he only exists in this one reality. The fact that he demonstrates disappointment or surprise with this particular failure again demonstrates his limitations, and the way he goes about solving it as well is rather bizarre. He could, but if he were this perfect and omnipotent entity, then his intentions would necessarily play themselves out. There would be no chance of reality conforming in any other way, one would assume. And this is the irony of the concept of God. It is an impotent of that God anyway. It's an impotent one. The perfect God is an impotent one because it doesn't need to act. It doesn't need to think. It doesn't need to do anything. If it is perfect, if it is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent, then reality must necessarily conform always under its expectations and under its intentions. It must. And this is before we even get into the notion of intention. It can't have intentions or feelings or thoughts, because these things are processes that demonstrate a necessity for transition from one state to the next, which demonstrates limitation. And if this being is perfect by its very nature, then it doesn't need these things. It is this perfect, self-reflexive, self-sustaining thing that does not need to do anything. This is the irony. It's impotent if it's perfect. It doesn't require anything, and the very notion of existence and reality is evidence against its existence, because it wouldn't need to create anything. It wouldn't have the intention or the desire, because again, intention and desire demonstrate a requirement to change one state from this to this, and it doesn't need to do that. As I said in an earlier video, the only way such an entity could exist, and I'm perfectly happy to sort of consider this, is if it is completely bound up with the concept of reality, if it is intrinsic to it. Rather than one being a creation of the other, they are the anatomy of one another in many respects. They're part of the same circuit. It's sort of a pantheism, if you like, which again the Romantic poets seem to demonstrate, this seeing God in reality. And the pagans also, and the polytheists, they seem to demonstrate this as well. The application of anthropomorphic personification, to borrow a Terry Pratchett term, to elements of reality, I think is an enlightened way of creating mythology. I can see why. I can see the beauty in that. And I can see the reasoning in it, seeing God in nature, and nature being the anatomy and an expression of divinity and metaphysics. Yes, I can definitely see that. But I think what we generally need is an expansion of our ideas. We need to allow our preconceptions of these things to open. And unfortunately, this is what religion stands against. And when I say religion, I am not talking about personal belief. I know lots of human beings who entertain a very personal notion of God, or of gods, or of metaphysics or spirituality, but do not adhere to any particular religion. Religion I would define as what it is defined as. That is the spiritual ligature. That's what that is the very definition of religion. It's even linked in terms of its linguistics. Religion and ligature, it means bound together and under a particular imposed belief. That's belief system. That's what religion means, and it's why I react against it, because it's born out of that tribalistic imperative which I bang on about, which demonstrates the weakness of our species. This requirement for the tribe that provides one sense of self-definition, and it's very, very damaging. I think it puts on blinkers and blinders. It prohibits imagination and thought, or rather, it attempts to put these very restrictive and choking restrictions and constraints on these processes, but it doesn't work. The actions and the behaviours of believers demonstrate this. I don't think there is a person who proclaims to adhere to a particular religion who does not consider outside of the parameters that it imposes. I think they do, but I think what it does is it creates this fear situation whereby you are afraid to think, you're afraid to follow that path of thought, or that image, that dream, or whatever. It states that if you think this, or if you continue that train of thought, then God will be angry and you'll be punished, you'll go to hell, you'll be sinning, or whatever. Basically it's Orwellian. It's a system of establishing thought crime. It says that you are not your own in your own head. And this is something that seems to characterize religions. They want to control people. They want to control people in the most intimate manner, not only in their bedrooms, in their personal lives, in the way they interact with human beings, but the way they think. And they can't. That, to me, is evident. I don't think they can. There is not a human being on this planet who does not consider, who does not think outside of their own personal parameters of behaviour, because that's what it's for, people. It's for the same thing that computer games and books and art are for, of which these things are expressions. It's this fundamental human need to think outside of our own parameters. And you shouldn't be afraid of imagining anything. And I mean that, anything. Anything you find morally repugnant, anything. You should be free to imagine it. And I personally think you should pursue it in your head, because it's the only way. It's the only way you can create a rounded perception of these factors. So things that you find utterly morally repugnant, I think you should consider, whether you're afraid of them or not. Things such as, for me personally, what do I find repugnant? Rape. Absolutely disgusting. It's one of the most appalling things, one of the most appalling acts a human being can commit. But within the playground of my own imagination, I can explore that concept from both sides, as it were, and thereby create an albeit abstract system of perceptions whereby I can assess the notion and why I find it repugnant. I have reason then. It's not just some culturally entrenched instinctive reaction. It's something that's considered, and that's what it's for. It's for the creation of abstract arenas in which we can pursue and explore what we can't in reality. And it allows us thereby to create schemas of perception by which we can assess these things and determine where we stand and why we stand where we stand. Just saying this is wrong or this is right or this is good or this is bad doesn't mean anything. Doesn't mean a thing. You have to assess why. You have to assess why it's wrong. And in the case of rape or paedophilia or anything to that effect, it's evident why it's wrong when you think about it, when you consider it, because there's a victim involved, because the action creates negative consequence, basically. It is an insult to human dignity. It undermines the notion of the individual. But this is what... furthermore to that, the arena of imagination allows us to explore things that we simply cannot in reality, via metaphor. It allows us to consider self-transcendence in a very real way, in an almost literal fashion. We can perceive of ourselves physically transforming, splitting, shedding ourselves, and becoming something else. It's what many fantasy authors explore via their works. If you look at the works of Clive Barker, one of my favourite authors, he explores this notion of human transcendence quite a lot, whereby the characters in his work sometimes literally skin themselves and emerge as something new. My own fiction is bound up with that as well. I'm sure those of you who listen to my poetry on this channel and some of my short stories that are up here as well know that there's a lot of personal transcendence and metaphysics. And that allows us to evolve as human beings intellectually and emotionally. It allows us to consider in ways and from perspectives that we couldn't otherwise. But this is what religion stunts, because it takes that responsibility away from the individual, and not only that, it creates this cell wall around it, whereby you're only allowed to consider this far. You're only allowed to consider this far, but you can't go any further than that. Therefore, the person who adheres to a religious ideology will necessarily be somewhat more limited than those who, say, adhere to a much more personal notion of God or of metaphysics. And this is the distinction I want to draw here. Religion is not God. God is not religion. Okay? Metaphysics and spirituality do not belong to churches. They do not belong to priests or religions or particular mythological ideologies or anything like that. In fact, for my money, what needs to happen is these people and these structures need to be told. They need to have God. They need to have the stories taken away from them. taken out of their hands, for the same reason that a chimp with the control it's playing around with the controls of a nuclear bomb has to have that taken out of its hands. They don't understand what they have, and they could quite easily cause an incredible amount of harm as a result. It doesn't belong to them, and unfortunately, we're still labouring under this preconception that God and religion are the same thing, that God and churches are the same thing, that God and priests are the same thing, and they're not. This is because of the way these churches and these systems operate. They are very parasitic, to my mind. They're very parasitic on a personal level and on a cultural level. On a personal level, they make the individual dependent upon them for their sense of self-definition. And become so entrenched with the concept of the person's preconceptions of who they are, that removing them, that attempting to remove the parasite becomes damaging to the individual. That's the way they work. The same is true on a cultural level. They have bound themselves up with the notion of God and made it so that it's very difficult for individuals to consider concepts of God that exist outside the ones that they mandate, despite the fact that there are plenty out there who do. I mean, one example I would use is H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft, although the man's writing gets on my tits sometimes because of his tumescent prose and the way he goes on and on and on about nothing, I like H.P. Lovecraft, I do. He makes me smile, simply because of what he's willing to consider in his fiction. In his fiction, there are godlike entities, the great old ones, beings like Great Cthulhu and Shub-Niggurath and all of those creatures. They are not gods, though, not as we understand them. They are simply extraterrestrial, extra-dimensional entities that are so close to our preconceptions of what gods must necessarily exhibit that it makes no difference. They are beings whose scale and whose capacities make human beings regard them as gods, even though they're not. And they are not, this is key, they are not benevolent. They do not have humanity's best interests at heart. And this is something you must necessarily consider if you're going to consider the notion of gods, or of entities like gods, things that are analogous to them. You must consider that you don't know them. You don't know what they are. You can't possibly know what they are, and I mistrust anyone, basically, who tells me they know what God or gods are, or what they think, or what they want, or what their characteristics are, because the necessary next question is, how do you know? How do you know this? Where are you getting this information from? And it's never satisfactory, unless, even if you have had personal interactions with these creatures, and I'm not talking about the vague feelings that some Christians and Muslims and whatnot mean when they talk about having a personal relationship with God or Jesus or whatnot. I mean actually interacting with this entity, seeing it, speaking to it, etc., etc. Even if you have that experience, I don't, and other people don't. It's not good enough. You can't expect other people to believe what you say based on your experience. But that's by the by. The raw fact of the matter is, these creatures, these entities, if they exist, may not have your best interests at heart, may not have humanity's best interests at heart. And this is something that H.P. Lovecraft explores quite a lot. The world, the universe he creates, and the mythology he creates is one of utter nihilism. It's one where the universe is populated by these entities, and they are entirely hostile. Their only desire is to harvest and consume humanity. That's what they want. And this is something you must necessarily consider, because it's a possibility. Again, it's an example of the evolution of preconceptions of gods, this notion of omnibenevolence, which the traditional gods profess and have attached to them but don't demonstrate, which is interesting. It's very, very interesting indeed. Personally, again, Lovecraft's mythology is an example of notions of God being taken out of the hands of the people who purport to be authorities on it but haven't considered it very deeply, obviously, or rather have considered it within these very narrow restrictions and parameters. Another example of the evolution of gods and goddesses and of the notion of divinity, again, comes from Clive Barker's books. In Clive Barker's books, there are many gods and divinities and whatnot, but they tend to be powers that were originally human. They're human beings who find a means of self-mythologization, of self-transcendence. A good example is Clive Barker's magnum opus, Imagica. Imagica is this epic fantasy work about the notion that there are 5 dominions, 5 realities, of which Earth is only one, and Earth is the unreconciled dominion. It is cut off from the others. The others interact perfectly well, and all the denizens within them can travel between one and the other, but Earth is cut off, it's unreconciled. And in the 5th dominion, there is an entity, a being that is worshipped by cults and churches within all of the others. He is the inspiration for the monotheistic gods in this reality. He is Allah, he is Yahweh and Jehovah. He is these entities. His actual name is Hapexomendios. And he is massively powerful, but he is limited. He is a man. He was a man originally, but who found a means of transcending himself. But despite all of these capacities, he is nevertheless a man, or rather he used to be a man. He is a man who found a means of transcending himself, of mythologizing himself to a degree whereby he became something entirely beyond humanity. But maintains so many of his human characteristics and flaws, which are reflective and reminiscent of the flaws and characteristics that Jehovah demonstrates and Allah demonstrate in their particular texts. That he is an enemy, he is a monster, and he must necessarily be destroyed. There are also other gods and goddesses in Imagica who are, again, mortal creatures that have found a means of transcending themselves, and this god Hapexomendios wants those destroyed. He wants them obliterated because they're challenges to his authority. He particularly dislikes goddesses. He has a thing against goddesses. He's quite misogynistic. Again, this demonstrates how limited our notions of God and of angels and whatnot actually are. And I think if you search through modern fantastical fiction, you will find examples of how notions of God are evolving in particular arenas. They're evolving and becoming something different, becoming something better. They're becoming numinous and abstract and very, very beautiful. And the authority, the responsibility has been taken out of the hands of churches and of priests, and I think that is it's escalating. It's escalating to a degree, and it demonstrates also why these structures, these power structures, are becoming increasingly conservative and defensive in many respects, because they're losing what they're ultimately about, which is power. They're losing their authority and their control over the individual. More and more people are moving away and becoming their own, developing their own very personal belief systems, which I think is entirely wonderful. I really like that. There is a problem at the moment with people supplanting one religion for another, or rather religions that they used to adhere to with structures that are reflective of all the problems of religions. I mean, in my last video I talked about how there are people who basically take the basic dynamic of religion and then create a similar structure around another concept, such as atheism or another philosophy or another intellectual position or whatever. It's the dynamic that's the problem. It's not the label it operates under. It's the dynamic that we need to shed. We need to get rid of certainty. That's the big thing. Certainty is the grand evil, particularly in cases of metaphysic notions and abstracts such as God. We need to get rid of preconceptions of knowledge where knowledge can't exist. And rather, we need to start considering the possibilities. We need to actually, instead of operating under certainty, we need to explore the concept. We need to think, we need to imagine and allow ourselves to imagine beyond the parameters under which it currently operates and under which we currently operate, and thereby the notion of God can actually become a vehicle of personal transcendence. It can actually become a vehicle of transgression, rather than of conformity and of stunting, stultifying restriction. And that's what we need, it seems to me, culturally speaking. We need to see the evolution of the concepts of God and of gods, and a proliferation of that state where we don't operate under tribalistic notions of God, i.e. my God is better than your God, or my God is truer than your God, blah 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 blah, and so on and so forth. Because ultimately it's schoolyard metaphysics, that one. It is basically my dad can beat up your dad, but on a metaphysics scale. It's exactly the same. We also need to remove the notion of judgment from gods as well, which, if you think about it, and consider it deeply, the notion of judgment is redundant to gods anyway. Why would they care? Why would an entity that, for example, could perceive all of time and all permutations of time, all the myriad ways in which reality might conform, down to the most minute detail, to one reality in which this molecule out there in space decided to drift this way instead of that way, all of those consequences, why would it care? Why would it concern itself with pettiness like what one entity on this one planet does with its time? In this one reality, in this one permutation of reality, why would it care? And besides which, it would already know. It wouldn't need to judge, it would already know. It would already know necessarily what that entity has done, and it would know it before this entity knows it, and it would already exist in those states where the consequences of that action are played out. So yes, that's in my rambly sort of stream of consciousness kind of way. I think I sort of got where I was going. I'm not sure, you'll have to let me know. Well, yes, that's what we need. We need evolution of God.